Bam.
Hi, this is Scott Richards, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
When you go to parties, what do you tell people that you do?
Oh, that's a good question. That depends a lot on my mood. But ordinarily, you just keep it simple. Strategic advisory for nation-state issues, or if it touches national security, to try to explain what national security actually means, that it's to do with the health of a nation-state.
I have a belief that the U.S., if I was going to write a PhD today, it would be that the U.S. is a net destabilizer when it goes to unstable places. Is that fair?
That's unequivocally true. And the longer that you spend, I think that when you start to look at the instability and areas of instability in the world, there's a number of striking patterns. The first is that there's a marked correlation between violent organizations and activity and post-colonial countries, first. And then when you look at what the grievances of these countries are, which are extremely valid in many cases, we then kind of have everybody coming out of the Cold War world where we had influence models that we sought to retain after the Cold War unnecessarily. And so in a lot of ways, even if you look at, we'll say, well, environment's going to cause a lot of issues, and human migration issues and water wars and violence and instability. Well, that's the product of unrestrained Western capitalism with growth demand for its economy. So there is a lot to be said for the grievances that exist. The objection would be the use of violence against civilians as terrorism, or the kind of the gathering of momentum around other movements, which are just no better for people, whether that's communism or whether that's Islamic extremism. But the grievance has a root. That's very hard to dismiss. That would be ethically and morally irresponsible.
And then when we get there, the actions that we take, and this is sort of where my work begins, is we tend to bring our own problems. First off, we export problems. This is separate from the problems that we bring with us. And we say, here are your problems, here are your solutions, here is the money. And then we give fuck all about the results after that. And then we're like, hey, you know what? It's gotten hard here and I got to get elected. I'm out. Take care of yourself, ladies.
Well, there's this idea that the Western society or whatever else had figured things out, that we had created stable governments where we don't have sort of revolutions, we don't have instability, but we have that consumerism, we have that economic consumption, by the ability to deprive other countries of whatever it is, whether that's cheap labor for making Nike shoes, or whether that's unfair trade agreements and the destruction of the natural resources to feed our habit. And I think there's a realization. I mean, I know I've had these conversations with the highest officers of countries, and they look and they'll tell me, Scott, the West or America comes to my country and they try to make the rules. And these days, we just tell them, if we see your democracy, we see your 2024 elections, you guys keep it.
Fair.
This is very high-level conversations. These things happen. And it is fair, because we created this really bizarre sense of, you're either with me or against me. And politics is that. We don't have centrism. We don't have, it's either you support Trump or you support Biden, and if you don't, then slander and insults will come your direction.
Yeah.
And that's insane.
Yeah. It is insane. It is insane.
And we try to sell that to the world. Be like us.
Yeah. Here's what I'm selling. I'm from America. Matter of fact, I'm from California. We're going to pick the lesser of two evils. How's that sound, other country? We got two evils. We're going to pick the best one of these two evils. Ha ha. Yeah. Aren't we a good partner?
we're going to pick the evil that we think in our mindset and our worldview is the best.
Yeah.
We're not going to do anything contextually related or culture related or consider anything cultural to your country because we've got it right and we espouse human rights. Yeah, we only do that selectively. And I would say that living in the world at large, and this is true of where we'll no doubt get into this conversation with Israel, Gaza, Iran, and the things that I've been having to contend with, is that the selective use of international law, the selective use of human rights, which are meant to be absolutely universal, much like the American Constitution is an amazing document. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is a tremendous document.
Right.
But we use that selectively. We use it punitively. To even entertain conversations. And initially, the Democrats were talking about sanctioning the ICJ before they saw some kind of sense. But to have a bill, it's like, what happens if that gets done? Does it mean that the ICJ is only good when it's against Putin or a safe Gaddafi or in Sudan? But as soon as it's someone that's ostensibly an ally, albeit using using disproportionate violence, that it's suddenly okay. And we can't do that if we want to have rules-based international order. It's just not an option.
Look, I'm an American. I'm proud of America. I think we've got a great thing here, right? But we get to be critical of it. That's part of the thing. And when you, as a nation, as a commander, when you push the kill button and you blow up someone's wedding and nobody goes to jail, there's a problem in that system. Well, we made a mistake. Well, that's manslaughter. You annihilated all of these people. You did that. And then look, we do as much as we can, I think, which is reasonable. But there has to be a penalty when you get things wrong, so that button is a little heavier to push. When we look at that, I'm going to let you go in one more second here. When the Houthis are firing and making our shipping harder, and people are rattling their sabers who didn't even have sabers 10 minutes ago because the cost of tortilla chips and shoes has gone up, and we're like, well, let's go fuck up these Houthis with missiles. And I got a problem with that. You don't just get to solve your economic problems because the Houthis have decided to lob rockets into a Gulf. Sorry, get out of your way.
It jumps in a bunch of things. The Houthis are a little bit more complex. Again, another subject I've been dealing with very closely and intensely for November. You're absolutely. I've met wedding crashers and their PTSD and what they have, but they have a chain which gives them instruction. And these are kids, those drone pilots, and 9 or 10 years of therapy on, still traumatized.
Right.
I would differentiate that from a war crime necessarily per se, but it is a failure of the kill chain, which at least needs someone to lose their job. A war crime being something more distinct is in the deliberate act of committing harm against a civilian population is much more ugly. Or to, the circumstances with humanitarian aid to Gaza, and to the conduct and to the use of munitions, the number of munitions. Those are different things, but accountability is what you're talking about.
Yeah, the accountability part. Right.
Yeah, and accountability in the kill chain, that someone didn't do their job properly, that they have strong, stiff penalty. If you deliberately blew up a wedding, then that's a war crime, and then that's a criminal sentence.
And just for clarity's sake, anybody listening, I was specifically referring to, a mistake, right? A mistake in intel, something unknown, but someone with some kind of brass on their shoulders has to make the call. That's not an Army lieutenant. It's not a captain in the Army. I'm using ranks for the Army just so we're clear. We're not mixing Navy ranks in here. But someone colonel or above makes that call, and those guys rarely get punished for getting that wrong. It's like, well, you're the commander in the field.
And if you saw a pattern of a particular captain or colonel had a larger number of these incidents, then I would call that criminal negligence.
Sure. Sure.
And then criminal negligence, as should, if it's consistent or occurs, more frequently than a mistake that is negligent, then that should be handled. And if we're going to maintain any kind of moral semblance, I often say that the world dreams America's nightmares. So when America is traumatized, the world at large feels it. Part of the problem, is that America was aspirational for the world. In the 90s, the 2000s, moving to America was the dream of every immigrant. America was the place where people made business and fortunes. America in the 90s, at least, was our moral leader until the morality of the Iraq War. The degradation of that since, and the thrashing of a dying hegemon is particularly painful in the world. But I always say to my American friends, I'm happiest when America is being its best.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And for a while.
And I would say too, we have to remember all of this stuff, like the dying hegemon, maybe true, maybe not, right? This is not me being an American. Wait 5 years, wait 10 years, and there's a rally, and all of a sudden everybody's booming on America. But the truth is, and when we started this conversation, I was very specific about how I brought this up. I talked about areas of instability, right? Our shipping worldwide, millions and millions of miles, not a problem. The blanket of American provided and provisioned and allied security is working perfectly. Our foreign policy is pretty good overall. Like most of it works great. Fringes, it gets nasty at the fringes. And I'm not saying we're perfect abroad, but I'm saying for the most part, you look around, you're like, yeah, this is all tolerable. Maybe there's a different way to approach this, but this works. The Straits of Malacca are free to transit, right?
I see it so differently.
Do you really?
Yeah, because in the work that specifically I do is I look at trajectory of violence and trend of violence and political drift and move, and then have to map and predict. So the Houthi have obviously an Iranian proxy. And the world is very far behind what we know. The idea of this division between AQIM and the Houthi has been fictional. That came out in the Telegraph finally. And so the Houthi in the UN, one particular individual, Han something or other, has been pushing to kind of take a Taliban model with the Houthi. The Houthi are diabolical in their civilian population. They're absolutely terrible. And they've managed to rally more support because of their position on the Israel-Gaza, always making this conflict, which we'll get into, as being much more than Hamas, expressing grievance or whatever else against Israel. It was a purely strategic move. So simultaneous to that is Houthis take control of that area. Then you have Iran and the Houthis more or less being able to box the Strait of Hormuz in. Then they have dominance and control over the Red Sea. Now it's come out what we've also known as they've been shipping weapons into Somalia, destabilizing that. In that same breath, we have military operations between Iran, Russia, China, and South Africa. So there's the Cape. So now we talk about we've lost that whole area potentially if it goes, if the multipolarism and instability extends. We've also lost portability in Africa with the Russians building ports in Mozambique. The Russians are building a port in Benghazi as well. So our idea that the Navy, which has been underfunded in the United States, is in any way near capable to deal with this is a complete myth. Yeah. Now we add in the nascent instability with China and Taiwan. So now our corridors for trade are a nightmare. And so this whole thing,
that they're more at risk now. Is that is that creep, or is that an administration? Like, do we put that on Biden? Do we put that on 20 years of neglect because of our fascination with Iraq and Afghanistan? Where do you put that?
Well, when you get, it's natural for any adversary to exploit gaps or weaknesses in the foreign policy of countries. And so there's a whole lot of smaller countries that we haven't deemed worthy, or that we haven't understood situations correctly. We backed, the West backed the GNA, an unconstitutional government in Tripoli, messed around Benghazi, sponsored people like General Haftar, who's the one who got the deal for a 5,000-acre Russian base in Benghazi,
Right.
which is started construction, which is amazing. We completely alienate South Africa, not considering the importance of the Cape. We don't support the tribes or an actual democratic movement in Yemen. So these locations, which we've understood through the entire Cold War to have incredible strategic value, we've just let fall because of the crappy, just our approach to these things. So we've created all these problems for ourselves. And with Israel Gaza, you had near criminalization in Tunisia for interactions with Israel. Algeria and Libya, similar. Libya did pass criminalization of interaction with Israel. So we completely alienated the West. Tunisia has Wagner bases going in. That's a stone's throw from the Strait of Gibraltar.
Yeah.
So we've lost all ability to control or project sea lanes at any more significant escalation. It's gone. And it's gone through this idea of I will openly say this when I discuss things, with the West, is why don't you try being a good partner? Let's try that first. Let's not try to control everyone. Let's try and be a good partner and build faith and trust back in these countries. So when they need something, they look to us.
So you're saying control them?
No, I'm saying be a good partner.
No, I'm being funny. I'm being like, I'm the American, and I'm saying, so you're saying you want me to control them?
Yeah. We go in and we think, we can control the corrupt person.
Right.
We can control this person because we've got this noose around it. You really don't have those pressure points. What you have is you're controlling someone who creates greater instability, and we ourselves are not being a good partner. We're forcing dichotomous choices. We're trying to break an order of things that's existed for much longer than whatever political situation we have here, whether it's tribalism or whatever. The West is making things worse. We're driving countries towards BRICS. It's unfortunate. It's tragic.
We do have a problem with trust. We do have a problem with control, and this is where we look at our neocons and the people that want to if they don't want to take over the world, but they want to take over the world. Like that's how they act, right? And that creates these problems. And when I'm talking about, hey, most everything works pretty good, right? Because most everything is controlled by a partnership of sorts. I'm being very big here. But there's always the flip side of that coin, right? It is a tenuous balance. It is also hard for China, Russia, South Africa, all these countries to similarly align themselves. Can they take and amass power? Sure, but they also have to maintain it. It's expensive to have 11 aircraft carriers and to build the proficiency and the contract structure that supports those things and the airplanes that you have to. Oh my gosh, it's enormously expensive. So the ability to provision all of that is one of the fail safes. Like when my friends ask me, are we going towards World War III? And I'm like, it's really expensive and hard, and it takes a lot of energy to make World War III happen. Could we go there? Sure, it's in the cone of possibility, but there's a whole lot more forces that tamp it down just because someone's going to be like, we just don't have the money for that, or we don't have the resources to do that, or we don't have the access to this to do that. And so we have to build other things. Can it happen? Yes, absolutely. But there's also a lot of kind of just, I don't know, when I see these things, I think about what it takes to maintain a level of violence that is hot enough to be what I would consider World War III. Man, it takes a lot of.
I see that differently as well, and
I love it.
I'm somewhat aware of how close we have come to World War III in the past 6 months.
Sure,
and somewhat aware of what you are saying is absolutely correct. That tamping that down is real because it would be so expensive.
Yeah.
But if I was wanting to shake the global order, I wouldn't conduct the World War III in the sense of an axis of allies and an axis of opponents. fighting at industrial scale. I would just grind everything down into one gigantic mire of instability where there are less allegiances, a series of regional wars that melt into a global war.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what Israel Gaza was always about. October 7th was about creating, was so horrible. And that's why anyone who says, well, Hamas are resistance fighters, straight up rapists not resistance. The attack on October 7th had a singular specific purpose, which was to cause Israeli overreaction to isolate Israel. Highly and extremely successful. And there's been enormous diplomatic action to restrain this from becoming a regional war. The first risk that we had was the massive Israeli bombardment against Israel in retaliation for the embassy attack. Had Israel not been tampered down, had not taken a restrained response, that would have been massive and escalatory. The next threshold is Lebanon, Israeli invasion in there. And then we come to a position where it's, okay, who will come in and support Israel? Egypt is very tenuous. Can you get the door? And worried about military buildup in the Sinai. Israel potentially facing 6 or 7 fronts if you include aerial bombardment from Yemen. So where does that leave the West? If we intervene there, that will spur jihadism to a huge extent. Al Qaeda have been very clear about their intentions, to erase U.S. presence in Iraq, to conduct continental attacks. So we don't need to have a world war in the sense that we understood it as like Russia versus the world, or China versus the world. No, you just create chaos, and that's where that attack was intended to take us. And to credit I've seen the best of the Biden administration since maybe February. Okay. Hang on, sweetie, whatever that is, it's not for you. It's Doris. My daughter has no respect for podcasts.
She just wants donuts. Damn it! Get her some donuts.
If I do that, then I'll be grabbing them from the door, and we'll get that after this. So there's a very, very complex series of events taking place, but the instability in Afghanistan, ready to project up to the Central Asia, instability there, instability, Pakistan unstable, destabilize the Middle East, Africa, just Burkina Faso, the most terror-struck place in the world as of today, the French being forced out of West Africa.
Right.
So it's a very different kind of world war, and then you just, it's like the old empires were never really taken down by a direct war, but by smaller countries nipping at their heels.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for that, and we're failing to meet our recruiting demands. We want to have this professional army that's lauded around the world, and we can't get people interested in it. And people would rather drive a car and drive people around and get paid for that, doing Uber or delivering food, because hey, they can make a couple $100 a day, doing that, as opposed to marching up a hill to go do some fight in some place where they don't want to be. It's a hard sell. So I get that. Let's get into specifically the Hamas and Israel fight, because look, let's try to take the politics out of this, but let's look at the hostage part, because I know that you deal with these things, as much as you can talk about this. Mm-hmm. But let's talk a little bit about where this is at, what is true, because we see a lot of BS in the news and on our streets here in America. We see a lot of protests, and it's hard for people to know what to take seriously. And look, one of the things I always talk about is like, when does our politics start and the actual problem begin? Because our left hates Netanyahu, hates him. They will always come after him. So it's like, where does this is not me speaking as a person on the right. I'm in the middle. Mm-hmm. So when I see that, and I know that that's there, how do we deal with these problems when we can't take the opposition seriously? Because why are they opposed? It's not even their prime minister. We have a president here. So please expand.
The Netanyahu coalition with Ben Gvir, in order to hold power, Beer is inherently, he's a theocrat with the desire to completely erase Gaza and to expand Israel, you know, to those borders and to hold power. Netanyahu has had to have that coalition. Netanyahu's father himself was also what's called a revisionist Zionist. So it is an extremist government. That's functionally true. And that's part of the problem with the idea of left, right, center. I don't consider myself any of these things. We have to concern ourselves with the personalities, positions, and desires of those in power, and then to understand how it is that those personalities get managed to prevent their worst selves acting out. So October 7th was conducted knowing that there would be an Israeli overreaction, knowing that there's a government in power that is incredibly right-wing and will act with minimal restraint in terms of its retaliation. And so Hamas's conduct of violence was not that of a freedom fighter. It was not an expression of rage. It was to induce Israel into a position which could actually lead to Israel losing a broader war. Hamas's charter founding purpose is to erase Israel.
Right.
And knowing that they were going to sacrifice civilian Gazans for this campaign to parade their deaths to isolate Israel. So they're not, under any circumstances, friends of Gazans. I have dealt with Hamas. I have convinced them at times to allow certain things in the interests of Gazans, and that's really the point of appeal, to really where a position for me becomes, if this doesn't turn into a regional war, if you don't achieve the isolation of Israel in this, you are now martyring your civilians for nothing.
Yeah.
Whereas we're at a position where if Hamas behaved sensibly, and in this paradigm, Hamas would have to surrender right to political participation, as would any other group like the PIJ, and then there's a two-state solution chance. Then there's even a chance to begin talking about the 67 borders. And it's not really a surrender because you get a country with greater self-determination. It's not a victory for Hamas for Israel because Hamas has to cede any role. I would constitutionally change that no one who's participated in nonviolence can enter politics. So the hostages find themselves at a very unique and difficult position. Not the hostage families as much as the representation of hostages. The hostages become the path to a ceasefire. Now Hamas knows that they can't release all of them. That's why it's suggested over phases, because then Netanyahu will have the hostages back and just bulldoze Gaza. So the stages are relevant and they make sense. And the reason that the 33 dead bodies, it makes sense when you understand the categories that were asked for, which follow an Islamic principle. So that also makes sense. But Hamas wants too much in that deal rather than having a phased approach. So you get this position where, I would say for a time, because of the number of hostages that were killed, we knew about 8 weeks ago how many were alive. It was at that time 83. And then we're holding 130. So 50 dead doesn't look good for Netanyahu. 50 dead doesn't look good for Hamas.
Right.
But there's still 83 people alive, and those 83 lives are important. And everything that must be done to save those 83 lives needs to be done. And so for neither party for a time was it considered politically viable, because Hamas then enters a more complex terrain. It's a Geneva Convention violation of the 3rd and 4th to hold civilians as hostages. Then if you're going to say that those that were combatant as POW, then you have legal obligation to treat them as POW with certain things. Standards. Right. If those standards aren't met, you violated international law. But the way out of the violence remains the hostages. And I work closely with a number of the hostage families, and you'll see that they are all asking for an end to the war and to a ceasefire. And so now we're in a position where Hamas needs to ask existential questions. And the existential question is very important for the left and the pro-Palestinian, because pro-Palestinian doesn't mean being pro-Hamas. Pro-Palestinian means caring about Palestinian lives. Pro-Hamas is something different. So the Hamas faction, that protest in America and calling them freedom fighters, well, there is a clear path to a two-state here. If Hamas doesn't, follow that path, they're not freedom fighters. That's not what they are.
Right.
Now, if you're going to say, well, the Israel shouldn't exist, well, then you're anti-Semitic. It's existed for 75 years now. And there were 700,000 Palestinians displaced. This is the post-colonial world. Okay, countries exist that didn't exist after World War II, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the English colonies. Pakistan was created with a displacement of 15 million people. But no one says Pakistan shouldn't exist. Israel exists. Accept it. Israel grew larger through the series of attacks that happened. The settlements are vividly illegal under international law. They need to be disbanded. And we should probably go back to the 67 border. And so there are ways out of this, but the idea of left and right, it's just not relevant.
I know it's not supposed to be relevant, but here it is, staring us in the face.
It is because we've divided America into left and right, and therefore we've made any political event, in countries that don't really have a left and right, we've made the left and right issue.
Right.
And so that's what I mean by not relevant. And what right do we have to put these issues for other countries, for people, for 2.3 million people in Gaza, for 1.3 million of them, that were pushed into Rafah, and you're going to make this left or right? It's not about that.
Yeah. So, look, that is a solution, and I understand that you're speaking from a point of view of expertise. There are other reasonable and rational solutions that are out there, and we've been at the point where a two-state solution has been on the table, and one of the two parties has consistently rejected it. So when I hear that, I understand that. When you say the 67 borders, man, I don't know that you're going to get Israel to cooperate with that, And so it's I'm not saying these things won't happen, but why wouldn't Israel just push on and say, no, we'll continue to push on? And it's viable to say allowing the Hamas folks to use this particular form of fighting as a means of winning is an invitation for more of the same in other places.
I mean, that would be an invitation, because what would then happen, and this has come down, there's limits what I could talk about, but I've been actively involved in discussions with all the stakeholders, whether it's hostages or whether it's the geopolitical resolution to this, including the Palestinian Authority, which is oddly ignored, even though it's the only legitimate and legal body currently, in that area, that can actually kind of conjoin the disparity that we have. Israel pushes in, Gavir decides they're undermining the West Bank. They decide to annex that. They push into Lebanon, which we've been expecting since the start of the year. It's probably going to occur sometime before August. It's a very simple proposition that happens. If Hamas accepts a peace deal or a ceasefire, you can make peace with Hamas. If Israel does not, you can't make peace with Israel. If we get to you can't make peace with Israel and they go into Lebanon, no one is going to come and help Israel. When Lebanon fights back, Iran comes in, and then Egypt gets nervous, and Israel loses. That is a very viable outcome, that Israel itself loses because of the arrogance and unwillingness to find a solution to a very long and unfortunate conflict, and to recognize that most people just want to live in peace. And then if you do find peace, you're able to build economies and have trade, the notions of borders become more fluid to travel. I'm not saying illegal immigration or whatever, but when you live, UK is not part of EU, but you don't make a great deal of jumping on a plane and going to the Netherlands or Germany. But to Israel to continue or escalate its violence when having the ICJ judgment against it, to invoke more settlements and annexations, that would lead to greater isolation of Israel, complete isolation of Israel from the Arab world. I would be surprised if the Abraham Accords continued. So it's just, there's a lot at stake here, and Iran would be able to say, it's not us. We told you, it's Israel. It's not us. And then people are going to say, well, maybe we've been treating Iran wrong all this time. We haven't. Iran treats its civilian population terribly. Right. Iran creates instability, and Iran hasn't shown any willingness to improve, on how it handles women's rights or whatever else.
Right. So when we look at this conflict, we have this, these, obviously, look, it's war, and people are going to continue to die, and gosh, people don't understand, like, people are not going to stop dying when the ceasefire happens. So let's say there was a deal, and let's say the deal is very favorable to Hamas. 6 months later,
I don't think we should look at a deal about being favorable to Hamas, because it's a phased deal. And the phases require building establishment of trust. And then we have to bring in the political conversation about Hamas cannot participate in the future of Gaza and the power of and Gaza and its whatever else. We need a stronger Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority is fully and willing to reform. They know their limitations. We need to, and these things are all happening. There are humanitarian initiatives being looked at to overcome the limitations of Kerem Shalom and the Rafah border. The recalcitrance of Egypt to cooperate with Israel while there's an heavy Israeli presence in Rafah because of their fear of militarization of the Sinai. All these things are known, and there are maps being drawn out of this to exit. But if you truly want to have peace, then you have to get the Hamas leadership to ask itself existential questions. Are you a movement of the people, or are you an Islamist organization that's trying to fulfill a prophetic mission by creating a holy wall? Yeah. If you're that, then we got to deal with you a different way. If you're
and I know we're going to try to build trust, but the organization that continues to walk away from two-state solutions, that continues to have these ridiculous requests within like a ceasefire agreement, that's the one that seems like it's wanting something more than what we're talking about here, right? The one that will put people on buses and blow themselves up, the one that will do that. And I'm not absolving Israel of anything bad, but that's the one that I don't trust 6 months, 3 years from now to not go and do something else, because they're not going to be satisfied with that, right? We're still going to have radicalized people.
No, it depends, because Gaza has been, the cause for jihad since bin Laden. It motivated bin Laden. It motivates jihadism. And the West's support of Israel has motivated jihadism. Hamza bin Laden is now announced as the new Emir, someone who we were told was dead and is not. Yeah. He also. So if the West is not being seen to be causing the suffering of Gazans and Muslims, then we decelerate jihad, and the West is the enemies of ordinary Muslim people who have every right to dignity and freedom.
Right.
Now, I've dealt with Hamas a few times. And I'll try to say what I can say about this. The first time required exiting foreign NGO workers from Gaza. And obviously Hamas has domain about their exit. I messaged Hamas and said, I need these people to leave because they've been there looking after Palestinians in need. And if they can't exit, if they die of dehydration, if they die of direct or indirect fire, they will not return. Within 2 hours, I have permission to exit them. The proof of lives that you've seen, earlier with Hirsch and things, same thing.
Right.
You can talk to Hamas. I have. And you just have to talk to these people in a way that they understand. And you don't talk to them to accuse them or whatever else. It's very simply to say, this is the situation. This is your choice. If you take choice A, this is going to happen, and you will cause suffering of the people of Gaza for ad infinitum. And within a few hours, they agreed. They're not wholly irrational. They're not. There's this idea of the jihadists as this almost being like psychotically addicted to violence. Right. They're not.
Right.
And so then it's the question for Hamas is that this hasn't gone where your plan you intended it to go with the destruction of Israel and the isolation of Israel. That part worked. So in the negotiations now, Hamas feels they have the public opinion on their side. So they're asking for more. They're behaving as a rational actor. However, they're pushing that envelope as most people do when they feel they have an advantage, far beyond what it actually is their advantage.
Yeah.
And so we have to bring them back and say, look, there's a deal on the table and you need to be reasonable, or it will be you can't make peace with Hamas, and then that public opinion will go to Israel. And then, so I'm going to say I have to be very selective on what I can say. I'm very much in the thick of this.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you talking about it, and I'm trying to ask questions to draw out like the complexity of this thing, because there is active negotiations going on, and there are different ideas being pushed in and pushed out, and look, the next time someone goes crawfish on a deal, it's not going to be the first, and it won't be the last, right? And so everybody's trying to hold each other accountable, and you need to have honest brokers in there. And so this stuff it's highly complex, and it's fraught with opportunities for all kinds of other things. And by the way, the entire time there are agents from every country trying to get their fingers in there to do something that they want done underneath the table. Like there's just, all these things are going on. There's all kinds of secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quintiary things that are happening in interest, right? And then there's dudes trying to make some money. They're like, I can make some money if I can get this one little thing done, right?
Oh, I mean, I saw that. I mean, I had requests come across, whether it was for vests or whatever else, or ammunition or whatever, and looked at them, but there are a lot of people just trying to do the wrong thing in there, and you have to do due diligence. What I would say, the Biden administration has, as I say, I've been hesitant in the past because they're handling Al Qaeda to say much positive about that administration. The forthright denials about Al Qaeda, which everything's now coming out in the open. But they have handled this situation elegantly. And that's always, kind of the view to me is that the responsibility is to the situation, to the people, not to a party for me. And so, I wouldn't, if Trump did something good, and a couple of things he did in his foreign policy were right, and then I would say, you know what, that's great. If Taliban once or twice have done a couple of okay things, doesn't erase all the horrible things they do, it's like, okay, well, that's fair enough. Egypt is the great unknown within this, and Egyptian politics and Egyptian public perception plays into this, because they really don't like Israel, but to the West, to Europe also, there's a very mature approach to this situation, and in that sense, the politics from the West are far less murky than they could be. I would say that unequivocally, that it's been a lot more pragmatic. And so the manipulations that you might expect in the world's most delicate conflict for the past 75 years, they're not as present as you'd find in, say, Afghanistan, which is such a quagmire of just political degeneracy. This is refreshingly purely personality politics. You've got Sinwar, difficult, and you've got Netanyahu, who is also under corruption charges at the same time as, being in this situation. He's got a coalition. He's, very, very anti-Palestine. So you've got two people diametrically opposed. How do we find something in the middle where we can, where as I could say, the motivation is always to minimize the loss of human life.
Yeah, right. Yeah, boy, and it's tough, right? Because like all of these things, there's more than one side to all of this stuff, and boy, I commend you on trying to work on minimizing the thing. Because as we talk about these big things, war, and Yemen, and I always bring up Myanmar because we just don't give a fuck about Myanmar, and it's atrocities constant there, But we don't care about them because for whatever reason that doesn't matter, right? But there's real people being killed for no damn reason out there, right? All the time. Because war is dumb, doesn't care.
And media that don't care. I know a number of people that have tried to work on the Rohingya and Myanmar issues, and they certainly don't get the time of day that they deserve. I myself just don't have the bandwidth, and that's kind of what the hard thing with social media or talking about things is, if you're working on Afghanistan, you're working on Africa, you're working on Israel, you're making a fact, and then someone will say, well, what about Sudan? Or what about Myanmar? It's like,
yeah,
I'm going 15, 16 hours a day.
Well, and that isn't at all criticism of you. What I'm saying.
No, I know, but it's this idea of that you have to, if you talk about saving human life,
yeah,
as a single or a handful of actors, you're expected to carry everyone's load. And
right.
Myanmar is terrible, and I wish I had the time and the strength. I wish I had the time and strength to sit down. It's no balance.
And by the way, with the person who's criticizing you, none of their help, So it's like
no, they don't. People just sit there and say, "We never done this."
Yeah. But it is a fact. Here in America, we didn't give two shits about Yemen 18 months ago. Probably couldn't point it out on a map. Still probably can't point it out on a map. And don't know what Oman is and don't have, So there's a lot of these things where we get awful precious with our opinions about Palestine, Hamas, don't know the difference between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And, all of this stuff wraps into, part of the critique that I have is just like, we want these solutions. And again, we're bringing our problem and our solution to somewhere where we don't understand what it takes to even get there. And I'm more critical of the foreign policy that the U.S. has tried to pull off the last 30 years. And that means I'm squarely critical of both Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken, because I think that they have largely, show me any American general or admiral, and they are over their career, right? They have not won a war. And Secretary Blinken is the state version of that. He has got things wrong more often than he's gotten them right. And that is always going to be true for him. So if you're telling me he's doing something elegant, I'll be like, well, fucking finally, for the first fucking time in his career.
It's true. Blinken just went to Israel and he went and met some of the hostage families that I know. Netanyahu hasn't done that. And they've urged restraint, and Netanyahu is not easy to bring restraint upon. He's made several statements, we'll go it alone, we'll do this, we'll do that. This is, and they've had to balance that Israel has been, there are two allies. This is something else I'll point out about October 7th for those that don't understand. There's two allies for America really in the Middle East. That's Jordan and that's Israel. Jordan is Al-Qaeda's primary target because, in a sense, Hamas is handling the Israel side of things. Why is there a fleet? Because we can't put jets in Saudi or the UAE or in Turkey that would be used to support Israel. So everything has to be done off a fleet. So they've been very successful in limiting the U.S.'s ability to project and have presence in the region. They pushed us out.
Yeah.
And that Jordan is a target. And then you understand that, you go, okay, now I see the picture of what's actually happening.
Yeah.
And to Biden and to Blinken, obviously I'm very disappointed in Blinken's activities and Tom West and Jake Sullivan with Afghanistan. It's been horrendous for half the population of women, and then the population of children and the malnutrition. But to this one instance, balancing that Israel has been, an ally that could ask things without question.
Mm.
Yeah. And I thought after the massive airstrike and bombardment that Netanyahu would strike Iran back hard in an effort to drag the United States into a war with Iran. So when you say talking about World War III, how close were we? Yeah, we were real close. Because if that had happened, and make no mistake, Iran is nuclear capable, then we would be somewhere very different if we had perhaps Trump in power and just had blind support for Israel, unquestioning, and Netanyahu took that license to just let's defeat Iran now, so we don't have to do it in 5 years' time. Then we would be in a very, very different place. Mm. So, in all fairness, I cannot criticize Biden or Blinken on this one matter.
All right, that's fair. And I don't want to give the impression that Blinken is wholly incompetent, right? He's gotten there by, having some wins under his belt. It's just, they're awfully hard to see.
I've generally, State Department has been a point of agony, for international relations. Wildly ineffective, contradictory policy. Yeah. But on the one hand, just tweeting, values of the United States, but acting on none of them. And that's incredibly damaging to the reputation of the United States.
We can go on and on about the State Department. And again, I opened this thing saying this is what my PhD thing would be, and you agreed because, and actually you started ahead of where my thesis would begin. But yeah, we have a problem with arrogance and incompetence. Mm-hmm. And then you get to go fuck up in the State Department, and then you go work for think tanks who are funded by foreign countries and foreign interests. And you get to act like you know what you're doing. But the reality is every time I show up in a place where it's hot and heavy and hard, and I know you have these kind of stories too. Mm-hmm. If I see State Department in the room and I'm like, oh, fuck, this is fucked up. And then almost instantly that person will be, I don't know, eye rolling the actual governor of that area. That's an actual story that happened. Yep. Like, if you can't eye roll the governor, that he is the governor, whether you want him to be or not, really doesn't matter. Like, you can get the fuck out of here.
Mm-hmm. It's not your country, and that's the guy you have to work with.
Yeah,
and that's just some of the Israel and the other conversations, in talking about the importance of the Palestinian Authority as a stabilizing factor, but having to remind, at some official levels at times that they are the state of Palestine.
Yeah,
they do have the aspect of sovereignty here, and so it's not for others to choose. And if they're willing to be a constructive partner, we should damn well pay attention. Now, Hamas knows that and is trying to attack the PA. So is PIJ, and Netanyahu has been undermining the West Bank because they know that the element of stability. So they're kind of the enemy to everyone for being on the right side of this.
Yeah. One of the things that is going to remain to be true is most of the states of the world do not recognize Palestine as a state. Is there a part of this situation where at the end of this, President Biden says, I now recognize Palestine as a state?
So to get there, we need to get to look at what does the state of Palestine look like. So in the United Nations, it's referred to as the state of Palestine.
But not recognized by the UN.
It has special observer status with about 98% of the privileges of a member state, but unable to vote on matters. So it has, in effect, the qualities of a state. It has more qualities of a state than the Taliban have, with whom we engage diplomatically with endlessly and furnish with finance, and with whom we accept the laws of the country from the Taliban, and for them de facto meaning illegitimate, and de facto in the case of them refers specifically to the taking of power by non-constitutional means. Whereas we have an elected, Palestinian Authority, so it has more credence by far than many others.
Right.
So given that special observer status, now to get in a point where I think that Blinken recently made a statement that they would recognize a two-state. This is about 2 or 3 days ago, but there have to be certain conditions in place. So what Palestine would need to do under the PA is reform to a point where recognition becomes formally viable as a country. And that is specifically why Hamas and the PIJ are against them. It's why there are elements of Israel against them. Because when that happens, this conversation changes. And then we get into a conversation where there's a post-Hamas world. And then we get into a conversation of peace. And then this is where I come to the point of, then we ask the question, can you make peace with Israel? And that's really a question of not Israel itself, but can you make peace with the Netanyahu government? And so that's a question for Israelis of the future that they want.
Yeah.
Do they want a future without rockets and living with iron domes? Do they want to not have the threat of terrorism? Do they not want another October 7th again? Okay, well, let's talk about how we get there. And it does mean removing Hamas from political participation. It does mean looking at what a political construct could be, and that has to begin with the Palestinian Authority because there is no one else, and that is an entity that's willing to improve, but recognizes its limitations.
Yeah, man, it's every time you say these things, and I'm not in disagreement, but I hear the other side of it too, where Israel is leaps and bounds a better country than it was 35 years ago. And that also goes to Netanyahu's favor because he's primarily been the prime minister during that time. He keeps getting elected, right? And so it is a crazy thing where you're like, yeah, he has been the guy that is, for better or for worse, he's been the dude. And Palestine,
he used Hamas as part of that. He there's a video recording of him talking about how he manipulates the United States. I think it's around 2000, about how he manipulates Hamas. And then the financing Hamas. So he's used the idea of a perennial enemy and the presence of constant threat. And so then you ask the question, well, what is his government without that constant threat?
Yeah. Yeah.
When you you don't need the strong man. Why is Putin in power? Because Russians need a strong man. Why do they need a strong man? Because Putin's on the idea that Russia's under perennial threat from the West.
Do Israelis like Russians love a strong man?
I can't answer that question. I don't like to speak on behalf of people, but I do. I do a number of Israelis, that protest every night, that want to see a change in administration. Israelis that want peace, and many of these are families that have hostages currently held by Hamas.
Right.
So it's not like. So this conversation is, very difficult, and that's the nature of democracies. Is that, if we looked at a peaceful situation with Palestine, with Gaza, what would elections look like in Israel? It's an open-ended question. If they chose a strong man, then that tells something about the collective psyche. If they choose something else, it tells something different. But you can't. It's like Palestinians. I know so many Palestinians that hate Hamas. It's
sure, yeah. Same thing with Persians, who hate the Iranian government, right? And but there's also that abuse thing. And again, I know you've seen this too. But when you go to a place like Iraq, you go to a place like Palestine, and I'm going to paint with a really big brush here, but you realize you do see the abuse, and it's like abused kids, abused wives, and how they act, and so they do want someone to protect them,
Yeah, I mean, there's very real trauma, and in the same way that you have to, when you take somebody from an abusive situation, whether a child or an adult, then you have to go through some sort of trauma therapy to come out of this. And I'm very lucky to know a guy, a friend of mine, Ahmed. He lost 31 members of his family in October to Israeli airstrikes, and he is the most profound and powerful voice for peace between Palestine and Israel. And he's not coming from a place of anger or hatred. He lost 31 family members. Wow. And so you can find voices and people that can speak to peace, but also pain and loss.
Yeah.
And we mutually understand the pain and the loss and say, is this the future that we want of cyclic violence forever? we have to find our way to peace, and it's not going to be easy.
No,
it's going to be trauma. But if we keep doing the same things, we're going to keep having the same wars.
Man, and I'll tell you what, I've had the same kind of conversations with sheikhs in Iraq, where they're like, I had my time of anger and violence, and it has led us to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm rejecting all of that, and watch them turn.
Yeah.
And look, I know you've seen this, where you physically see it on their face, and they give up all of that stuff, and they become much more reflective. It's almost like they've I'm going to do the best example. It's almost like they've done DMT or something, and they've become a different person because they've seen it. But then you look across the room, and there's the sun, and you're like, God damn, how do we get out of this, right? Because the guy I'm talking to is, 55 years old or whatever, and he's like, there's no more. I'm not going to do this. I'm tired of going to funerals. I'm tired of dead babies. And then you look at the son, who's still like, he's bringing tea, and he's looking, and you see him seething, and you're like, God damn, oh my God, this is one of the reasons I love talking to you, is because you and I can talk about the complexity without our egos getting in the way, because you're still actively doing it, but I've done this kind of stuff, and I know how hard it can be. And then you and I can sit in the room and both see different things, have a conversation later, and open each other's eyes and be like, oh, okay, we actually have to back this up and try this, No,
I mean,
there's so many things. You and I are having a conversation mentally right now that we can't even say, because there's so much in it. It's hard to do. So I always appreciate talking to you.
No, so do I. And it's been a while, but I've just been kind of very busy. And, part of the thing is with social media, although I communicate to decision makers quite a lot, I speak as openly as I can, as freely as I can, in the limits that I can, because I don't assume that I know everything. And I like to listen to anyone from anywhere in the world, chime in. And, sometimes people disagree, and I'll do my best to talk through a situation to kind of give them a picture of what factors that they may not see. But sometimes I'll get insights that I'm like, if I didn't have that, a briefing to a decision maker would have been vividly different, much less effective, much less powerful. And the same to learning from the wisdom of your experience, and that you and I understand all decisions are made by human beings at the end of the day. And although we have these parties and these manifestos or policies or whatever, at the end of the day, it's still a human being. And when you can cut through all of that rhetoric and say, right, well, maybe there's a different way to approach this. Because if you're approaching the party line, you're just going to be dogmatic about it, and you're going to have a negative result.
Yeah. And then all of this, and I'm not going to keep you much longer, but all of this makes me think of, currently there's the Lance Armstrong 2-part documentary is on Netflix, at least here in America. And, he was just like a fantastic competitor, just a warrior on a bike, right? Sure, he was doping. Sure, his competitors were. And you go through this whole entire thing, and he's an ass. He's a dick, but that's also what makes him a great champion, Yeah. But he backs himself into a corner, and you can't admit, you're like, I'm in the middle of making millions of dollars and winning championships. You think I'm going to be honest, And I think about all the sides. They are all backed into corners, and we'll just use Netanyahu because it's the easiest, right? You got to tease that guy out of that corner, Like, hey, you got to give this something up. And it's super hard to do that. I wouldn't do it. I'd be like, fuck you, I'm doubling down. I'm going to punch back,
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge. But the real risk is, and for lack of a better term, and this is the real language that's been used, is that a lot of the work is trying to prevent Israel from committing suicide. And because, my family has very, very deep connections to the Holocaust, as deep as it can humanly get. But that doesn't, give certain privileges or whatever else. To me, what it gives is an understanding of our capacities for atrocity against each other. And that we should be mindful of the use of violence at all times. But so to Netanyahu's existential question is, do I put Israel at risk, for my pride or for a vision of something which is, unfair to an entire population of people. For what purpose?
Yeah.
You know, if,
Yeah.
you know, it, you know, there are issues with the holy sites, Alaska Mosque, or whatever else. But if you have peace, then everybody can enjoy the holy site. You don't
Right.
need to own it. You need to control. It's a holy site. It's beyond borders, beyond territory. You know, if, in fact, you know, you could give us a bit like the Vatican, give a special designation to the area, so it's not, you know, or you know, like an extraterritorial legal designation,
Sure.
and then we can solve these problems. But be creative rather than violent or
Yeah.
prideful. But Israel is really putting itself at risk, and that's the question for Israel. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I started this whole thing by using Netanyahu as the example, but you can pick any one of these world leaders and put them in that thing. And by the way, if you have a God, he tends to collect people and go, now try it, you know, and you know, throw someone into a helicopter in the fog and they smash into the side of a mountain, and you're like, and now there's a new variable, and now there's a new variable, and weird things happen, and you know.
And those variables, you know, we have to, you know, when that happens, everyone's asking my opinion, what is happening? It's like, you know what, we just have to observe, and to look at how it changes the board, and to look at how we continue to work towards peace and minimizing the loss of human life. And I will say often, you know, I don't know who the next Einstein will be. It could be a kid from Zimbabwe. It could be a girl from Afghanistan. It could be someone from Nicaragua. How about we maximize opportunity and potential of all human beings? Because we have a common experience of life. We are more similar than we are different.
Yeah.
And the idea of there's no right in culture per se. I will say that cultural trends are aspects that deprive a person of their ability to make their own decisions. Or achieve their potential is a violation of human rights. You know, so I'd say you could never. I would never argue that, you know, with respect to Taliban, their culture. Their culture deprives individuals of their basic intrinsic human rights. So Taliban are fine until it reaches that line, and that's where the distinction has to exist. We either believe that the experience of being a human being is universal, or it isn't, and it damn well is. Otherwise, we wouldn't have commonality in our movies. You know, someone from Argentina wouldn't be able to understand a Marvel film. Someone wouldn't be able to understand, you know, Asian cinema from Georgia. But we are able to see the emotions of storytelling and common emotions across cultures because we are the same. We have the same organic structures, neural structures. We have the same emotional platform. We just have different ways of expressing it.
Well, I'm going to say one more thing, and just to kind of put a pin on my side of it, then I'm going to let you have the floor to wrap it up. And I mean this to be challenging, because not to you, but just in general for anybody who's listening, because this stuff is hard. When we look at all these things and all the world leaders, recently Donald Trump was one of the world leaders. He's not a leader now, but he's running to be one, and he's been one recently.
Likely will be.
Yeah, and the newscaster, and anybody who looks and sees how our news treats Donald Trump. And she was asking him, you know, about the war. I think it was the war in Ukraine, and you know what he would do about it. He's like, I'd stop it like in day one. And she's like, what are you talking about? Why? And all that kind of thing. And then he said something that would be near and dear to your heart. He's like, people are dying. And it makes people uncomfortable as fuck when he says that, because now it's like a dilemma. You're like, here's this guy that we despise, and he said the thing that is the most true thing of all.
I mean, these things are very difficult because we want people to be monochromatic. That if you have one negative value or something that they disagree with, then all of your values must be disagreed with. Yeah. And for, you know, he has atrocious positions on women, and atrocious things that he says. Maybe whether he means them or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But you know, to espouse these things and to say these things is terrible in and of itself. But it doesn't mean that everything he's going to say is going to be wrong. And so, you know, just taking this position of, I disagree with you on everything that you do because of, you know, 1, 5, 10 things that you did, isn't really correct either. It means I'm probably not going to trust you to do a lot of things.
Right. Yeah.
But it doesn't mean you're always wrong. And it means when there are things that are particularly important, knowing of what your nature can be, I may not be comfortable with the outcome of certain decisions, but it doesn't mean you're always wrong. And into the same way, I disagree with so much of the Biden administration, but I will not lie, and just because I disagree with so much of the other stuff, and say that his handling of Israel and Gaza and Iran since, say, February has been anything short of elegant. It has been. And certainly when on such a dangerous and volatile situation, respect for their ability to show and demonstrate competence at this point. That's just being, I don't know, to me, it's just being fair.
Fair enough. I love it. Thanks. Way to nail the landing. And let's
This was a good one.
What's that?
This was, as always, I'm very honored to be on and to be able to talk with you. And I can talk very easily because you understand what it is that I'm talking about. And hopefully we talk in a way that can give people pause for reflection and to sort of see how things work, because it's not how you imagine if you're not living in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, getting the task of, hey, Scott, get these people out and call Hamas to do it. That's your job. And then you call these guys and you have to figure out the words to say to do that, right? Like this is what you're tasked with, and huge respect for that. All right, let me wrap this up. I'll come right back to you.
Yep.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you